Hi, welcome to the Bible and American History. Today I'm going to read from the Founders Bible, a section that is called Separation of Church and State, its original intent. And this is taken from 2 Chronicles chapter 26. The phrase, separation of church and state, has been invoked in over 4,000 legal cases in recent decades. It is cited as the reason for the removal of nativity scenes from public parks, Ten Commandment displays from courtrooms, public prayer from school events, religious symbols from city seals, as well as the prohibition of several types of popular religious expressions. The founding father most associated with the separation phrase is Thomas Jefferson, and while the phrase is definitely familiar to most today, its history is largely unknown. Significantly, Jefferson was actually a latecomer to this famous metaphor, for it has long since been introduced in the 1500s by prominent ministers in England. Throughout the 1600s, it was carried to America by Bible-oriented colonists who planted it deeply in the thinking of Americans, all along before Jefferson ever repeated it. So what is the historic origin of this now popular phrase? When God established civil governments for his people Israel, he placed Moses over the civil affairs and Aaron over the spiritual ones. The nation was one, but the jurisdiction were two, with separate leaders over each. The account of King Uzziah of Judah in 2 Chronicles chapter 26 provides a lucid illustration of how God insisted that the two jurisdictions be kept separate. Uzziah's reign lasted 52 years, a remarkable span for that era in world history. Prosperity and stability characterized his civil rulership. His agricultural and animal husbandry programs were legendary. His national defense program was unrivaled. He invented many new machines of war, including improved catapults as well as complex but advanced arrow shooting machines. His fame spread across the civilized world. His personal piety toward God was also well known, and he openly and boldly honored God throughout his kingdom. According to the scriptures, all of this was highly recommendable, but then a dramatic change occurred. The turning point is recorded in verse 16 with the revealing statement that Uzziah entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. As civil ruler over the kingdom, he decided that he would also take unto himself the functions of a priest by burning incense on the altar. But that duty had been strictly reserved by God for his priests. Uzziah, by trying to perform the responsibilities of both church and state and become the head in each, had thus crossed a line drawn by God himself. Understanding this violation, the priests courageously and forcefully withstood him. This is found in verse 18. But Uzziah refused to listen and became enraged at them. He seized the sacred utensils and prepared to make use of them when God weighed in. He instantly struck Uzziah with leprosy, who fled the temple in horror and humiliation. Significantly, it had been acceptable for Uzziah to honor God in his kingdom, and it had been acceptable for Uzziah to enter the temple to worship God. But when Uzziah attempted to violate the jurisdictional separation between state and church, when he sought to be in charge of both the civil and religious arenas at the same time, God provided a dramatic precedent as a message of warning to all future generations. In the first 3 centuries of Christianity, there had been no attempt to merge the 2 separate and distinct God-ordained institutions of state and church, but that changed when Roman Emperor Theodosius I unalterately assumed control of the church and assimilated it into the state, decreeing Christianity as the official religion of his massive empire and declaring all other religions illegal. With that edict, the state crossed the boundary God had established, and Christianity became coercive, thus repudiating the voluntariness infused into it by Christ himself. Thereafter, emperors of the state regularly made themselves officers of the church. It became a time of the secularization of the church and the deprivation of Christianity, a time when state leaders wrongly believed that one of the chief duties of an imperial ruler was to place his sword at the service of the church and orthodoxy. Because state and church became one, a church leader therefore became a state official and answered to state authorities, being required to enforce any religious doctrines the state decreed. Understandably, widespread atrocities marked this period, and civil and religious rulers, often one and the same, were frequently ruthless, ever inventing new sadistic tortures and inflicting death with the same lack of compunction they manifested when squishing a roach in the putrid vermin-infested dungeons they frequently maintained. A review of Fox's Book of Martyrs, published in 1563, and some 2,300 pages in length, enumerates the slaughters of countless thousands of Christians by these so-called Christian leaders. Because the church had been taken over by the state, it was Bible-based ministers who finally stood up and demanded that the state separate from the church. In fact, English clergyman Richard Hooker was the first to use the phrase. King Henry VIII, 1491 through 1547, had wanted a divorce, but the church properly refused to give him one. So he started his own national church, the Anglican Church, and after decreeing new state-established doctrines, he gave himself a divorce. The English Parliament also passed laws stipulating who could take communion and who could be a minister of the gospel, thus governmentally controlling and directing what should have been purely ecclesiastical matters. The Reverend Hooker knew that it was wrong for the state to establish religious doctrines and dictate beliefs and practices for the church, so he called for a separation of church and commonwealth. Other Bible-centered ministers who spoke out against the intrusion of the state into the jurisdiction of the church, including the Reverend John Greenwood, 1556 through 1593, England. At that time, Queen Elizabeth I was head over both the state and the church, but Greenwood asserted that there could be but one head to the church, and that head was not the Queen but Christ. He was eventually executed for denying Her Majesty's ecclesiastical supremacy and attacking the existing ecclesiastical order. Then, when Parliament passed a law requiring that if any of Her Majesty's subjects deny the Queen's ecclesiastical supremacy, they shall be committed to prison without bail. Most of the pilgrims fled England to Holland. They subsequently moved from Holland to America, where they boldly advocated separation of church and state, asserting that government had no right to compel religion to plant churches by power and to force a submission to ecclesiastical government by laws and penalties. Many of the other Christian colonists who came to America had also been the subjects of Christian persecution at the hands of state leaders who had taken over the church. For example, a decade after the Pilgrims settled at Plymouth, 20,000 Puritans also fled England after many received life sentences or had their noses slit, ears cut off, or a brand placed on their foreheads for not adhering to state mandated Anglican teachings. Others coming to America for similar reasons included Jews facing the Inquisition in Portugal, 1654, Quakers fleeing England after some 10,000 had been imprisoned or tortured, 1680, Anabaptists, Mennonites, Moravians, Dunkers, etc., persecuted in Germany, 1683, 400,000 Bible-believing Huguenots persecuted in France, 1685, 20,000 Lutherans expelled from Austria, 1731, etc. And just as the Pilgrims had come to America advocating the separation of the state from the church, other Bible-centered ministers and colonists traveling from Europe did the same, such as the Reverend Roger Williams, 1603 to 1683, the Reverend John Weiss, 1652 through 1725, the Reverend William Penn, 1614 through 1718, and many more. Early American Methodist Bishop Charles Galloway summarized not only what Bible-believing ministers had concluded, but especially what God himself had established as the standard, declaring, "The matter and the crown should never encircle the same brow. The crosier and the scepter should never be wielded by the same hand." Of the four items specifically mentioned, the mitre, crown, crosier, and scepter, two reference the church and to the state. Concerning the church, the mitre was the headgear worn by the high priest in Jewish times. Exodus 28, verses 3 and 4, chapter 35 through 37, and later by popes, cardinals, and bishops, and the crosier was the shepherd's crook carried by church officials during special ceremonies pertaining to the state. The crown was the symbol of authority placed upon the heads of kings, and the scepter was held in their hand as an emblem of their intensive power. Esther chapter 4, verse 11. Therefore, the metaphor that the mitre and the crown should never encircle the same brow meant that the same person could not be the head of the state and the head of the church. Galloway's phrase not only provided a clear and easily understood, Therefore, the metaphor that the mitre and the crown should never encircle the same brow meant that the same person should not be the head of the state and the head of the church. Galloway's phrase not only provided a clear and easily understandable visual picture, but it also referred to specific historical incidents, as when Roman Emperor Otto II, 1980 through 1002, constructed his king's crown to fit atop the mitre worn by church officials, thus wearing the crowns of both state and church at the same time. The entire history of the separation of doctrine had been to prevent the state from meddling with interfering against or controlling the church's beliefs and religious expressions. Consequently, the separation of doctrine was never used to secularize the public square, but quite the contrary. It existed to protect rather than remove voluntary public religious practices, as affirmed by early Quaker leader Will Wood. The separation of church and state does not mean the exclusion of God, righteousness, morality from the state. Galloway agreed the separation of the church from the state did not mean the severance of the state from God or of the nation from Christianity. This philosophy of keeping the state limited from exerting control over public religious practices and expressions was planted deeply into American thinking and eventually enshrined in the First Amendment, which states, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." The first part of the amendment is now called the Establishment Clause, and the latter part the Free Exercise Clause. The language of both is clear, and both clauses were pointed solely at the state, not at the church. Notice that the Establishment Clause prohibited the state from enforcing religious conformity, and the Free Exercise Clause ensured that the state would protect rather than suppress, as it currently does, citizens' rights of conscience and religious expression. Both clauses are prohibitions only on the power of Congress, the government, not on religious individuals or organizations. This was the meaning of separation of church and state, with which Thomas Jefferson was intimately familiar, and it was this interpretation that he repeatedly reaffirmed in his writings and practices, not the modern perversion of it. Thank you for listening.